friends, and welcome to Ye Olde Bestsellers Book Club, where I am taking a look at some of America's earliest best-selling novels. Now, when I say best-selling, I don't just mean a book that was popular or that sold really well. That would take us back way further in history. Bestseller here means appearing on a bestsellers list, like the New York Times list of today. In the US, the agreed-on earliest appearance of such a list comes from The Bookman, which was a monthly book-related magazine published in the late 19th, early 20th century. This would be the American Bookman, not the London-based one, which started slightly before. And the original thought was that I was going to pick one of the top books from any given year and read through it, summarize, chat about stuff, and that's still mostly what's going on. But determining what the top books were from any given year became surprisingly complicated. Not because it's that hard, but just because it led me down a rabbit hole that I have now spent way too much time in to not talk about. Now, there is a Wikipedia page listing what it describes as the Bookman's top 10 best-selling novels from each year that it was running. I'm not entirely sure where that top 10 came from exactly, because the Bookman itself, as far as I have found, doesn't present top 10s. There isn't even one overall list. This is where things get messy. So each issue, which this magazine was monthly, so every month, they published lists of the best-selling novels for each month. That is lists, plural. Some of these lists are ranked, numbered. Here's a handful of the most popular books in order of demand from this month, but each month can have, say, 23 of those ranked lists because they are reported by booksellers from individual cities. So you'll have a ranked top 6 from Cincinnati, another from Denver, another from Los Angeles, 4 separate entries from the state of New York, 2 of which are both New York City, which gets a separate list for uptown and downtown, respectively. Meanwhile, Boston and Chicago just appear twice, labeled exactly the same, but presenting pretty different lists, and I don't know why. And you could probably wrangle a top 10 of the year out of these lists. I just personally wouldn't know how to weight them against each other. Like, what percentage of total sales does each list represent? Surely uptown New York, the entirety of Los Angeles, and Hartford, Connecticut aren't all perfectly equal slices of the book sales pie in 1895. Then alongside these 24 ranked mini-lists, there are also 2 other lists at the end of the so-called Eastern and Western letter, which are each a half-page breakdown from someone in New York and Chicago, respectively, that discuss in general how overall book sales were, seasonal trends, why people might be buying an unprecedented number of bird identification handbooks, and then a longer list, usually 15 or more books, but these don't seem to be in any particular order. It's just, here's a bunch of books that did well. All of this to say, the Bookman published lists of the top-selling novels of the time. As far as I have found, they were not organized into neat, orderly top 10 of the year lists. I don't know where the Wikipedia Bookman top 10s came from, though they do seem to line up with the books that the Bookman reported as popular, as I imagine any popularity list of the time generally would. And all of that to say, hi, I'm taking books that were popular, according to the Bookman, and reading them and talking about them to see what sort of stuff people read for fun back in the day that we've mostly forgotten about, and how it reads now, to a relatively uneducated modern eye, for funsies. So today we are starting with The Adventures of Captain Horn by Frank R. Stockton. Stockton was born in 1834 and didn't become a published writer until later in his life. He's better known for children's stories, short stories, fables. His short The Lady or the Tiger is probably the most well-known of his works. Captain Horn was published in 1895 and sold pretty well, as reported by the Bookman, which also started in 1895. It's an adventure story, as the title may suggest, and I am going to start by just reading out an excerpt of the beginning to set the scene, with Chapter 1, An Introductory Disaster. Quote, early in the spring of the year 1884, the 3-masted schooner Castor from San Francisco to Valparaiso was struck by a tornado off the coast of Peru. The storm, which rose with frightful suddenness, was of short duration, but it left the Castor a helpless wreck. Her mast had snapped off and gone overboard, her rudder post had been shattered by falling wreckage, and she was rolling in the trough of the sea with her floating masts and spars thumping and bumping her sides. The Castor was an American merchant vessel commanded by Captain Philip Horn, an experienced navigator of about 35 years of age. Besides valuable cargo, she carried 3 passengers, 2 ladies, and a boy. So these three passengers are middle-aged widow Mrs. Cliff, Miss Edna Markham, a schoolteacher who is specifically stated to look older than her actual 25 for some reason, and Edna's 15-year-old brother Ralph. No one gets injured in the whole shipwrecking, and the caster actually takes a few hours to sink, so they have time to unload all of the people and some supplies into 2 rowboats, and they row for 3 days until they hit land on a barren, rocky Peruvian coast overlooked by mountains. They get a camp set up and send a group of 8 men in one of the rowboats to go and find help, which leaves the captain on shore with the 2 women, the boy, 3 sailors, and the cook, an African man named Maka. And oh boy! Maka! This is probably the time to note that this book, there is so much old-timey racism in this book. There are quite a few African characters, spoilers, all of them not treated so great. So that is a thing that is going to come up a lot, and is going to come up more than I am even mentioning it, because otherwise it would get really repetitive, but know that it's there all of the time. So Maka is a great cook, speaks some English, but not a lot, and possesses, quote, better intelligence than most of his fellows. Pretty soon, after getting a camp together, 2 of the 3 sailors want to go and look for some game to hunt, hike around a little, maybe get a lay of the land. The captain says, okay, be careful, come back before dark. They do not. So the next day, the 3rd and final sailor wants to go and look for them, and the captain's like, but eventually says, okay, just stay on the beach where you can't fall off a cliff or get lost, and fire your gun in the air a few times and see if they signal you back. And definitely come back before dark. He does not. Also, the 15-year-old boy, Ralph, really wanted to go with him because he was, quote, getting very restless and longed for a ramble and scramble. And I like the phrase ramble and scramble. I haven't heard it before. The captain is very worried that all of his men might be getting eaten by jaguars, pumas, black bears, to which I said, excuse me, are there black bears in South America? Apparently there is one species of bear native to South America, the Andean, or spectacled bear. They're very cute. They do hang out in Peru, and they are mostly black, so okay, I'll give it to him. Ralph is appointed to fire duty to give him something to do, and it takes him all of 15 minutes to set the camp on fire. Or, at least a bunch of dried out vines on a rock wall right up against the camp. Not the tents, at least. They can't really do anything about it, so they all just watch, and a big mass of burned up vine falls away and reveals a massive 8-foot face carved into the stone of this rock wall. Ralph finds a sort of tunnel entrance in the rock near the face, and he and the captain go exploring. The tunnel seems kind of man-made, and there's a handful of wide-open spaces, like big rooms with cracks and gaps in the ceiling that let a bunch of light in from the sky outside. They decide to move their camp inside, so it's more defensible in case they are besieged by cute, bespectacled bears. Further exploration of the tunnel leads to a massive, vast room with a big old lake in it, extending farther off than they can even see in one direction. It's a very big lake. A lot of it is covered in this overhanging cave roof, but some of that has fallen in, and there's also a big gaping hole in the wall that leads to outside, but it's on the other side. They can't, walk to it. Another African man shows up and joins the party, who Maka actually knows, I guess, from way back in the day. This guy's name is, quote, something like Mock. He doesn't really speak English, but Maka translates, and Mock says that he has recently escaped the camp of the Rackbirds, a group of ruthless, violent outlaws currently in hiding who, quote, surpassed in cruelty and utter vileness any other bandits of whom he, the captain, had ever heard. The Rackbirds have this cave so far up a cliff face in a ravine near their camp that it can only be reached by a ladder, and it's in that cave that they have been keeping Mock, as well as 4 other African men, as prisoners and slaves to serve them. Mock escaped shortly before he would have been killed for some minor unspecified offense. The captain then calls Mock a dirty wretch, direct quote, for potentially leading the Rackbirds to them, which, yikes, dude, he just escaped nearly being murdered, but thanks for your sympathy. The whole group sets up to defend themselves in the cave overnight and have people on watch in case of rackbirds. Apparently Edna, the school teacher, has had a pistol in her back pocket this whole time, so she's ready. Maka and Ralph share a shift of watch, and they both fall asleep, but Edna knows her brother's, quote, healthy, sleepy nature well enough that, quote, when he went on watch, she went on watch, so she's awake. Not that it matters. 3 rackbirds do prowl around outside, and they hear so much snoring, at which point they just go back and give a report to their leader to make some plans of attack. Cut to next morning. No one is the wiser that they have been scouted. They're having breakfast. Ralph is missing. Captain Horn goes looking and finds that Ralph has swum out to investigate that big hole in the wall of the lake room, but then he got a leg cramp, so he's stuck on a rock and he can't swim anymore, and he needs the captain to come save him, which he does. I'm gonna say it now, it's gonna come up again later. Ralph acts regularly. I forgot in the beginning that he was described as 15, and for a large portion of this book, I was picturing him as like a 12-year-old, maybe an 11-year-old, for a lot of reasons. This boy is 15. That's like a man, almost. Like, it's a kid, but it's a man also. In the process of saving him, the captain grabs a hold of what he thinks is some sort of tree branch in the water for support, but he slips and accidentally pulls on it, and I promise that'll be important. Sometime later, they come back. The lake is gone. No one knows how, or why, or exactly when. It's just gone. 4 of the other rackbird's prisoners show up, one of whom is named Chetatafa, and he can also speak some amount of English, and says that a sudden flood has come tearing through the ravine and swept all of the rackbirds and their huts out to sea, killing all of them. Edna theorizes that this must be where the lake went, somehow. The prisoners managed to safely descend from their cave, and they had a big feast from the rackbird storage cellar, and then, quote, being very anxious to find good white people who could take care of them, they come looking for the shipwrecked party that they had overheard the rackbirds were planning to attack. Captain Horn later goes to explore the drained-out lake bed for some clue, spelled C-L-E-W, which is apparently an outdated spelling of clue, who knew, for why and how the lake disappeared. Apparently that branch that he had pulled on was a lever, and through some complicated underwater machinery, pulling that lever drains the entire lake. Meanwhile, the other white folk are eating, with 6 servants to wait on them. There are 3 of you. You do not need 6 servants. You do not need any servants. And these poor men just escaped from horrible imprisonment. Just be nice to them. Back in the drained lake bed, Captain Horn finds a big 10-foot dome thing, a man-made mound with handholds to climb up the sides. And on seeing this mound, the captain deduces that this whole lake cave situation is not entirely natural, and that the roof itself is man-made to hide the lake, which is man-made to hide the mound. So this super-secret mound is probably an ancient tomb or something. It's not entirely clear how or why he thinks they built the whole roof. But okay, he and Ralph manage to remove a square slab sealed into the top and find inside not a desecrated mummy, but a wealth of gold. Edna promptly faints. When she's done with that, she theorizes from some knowledge of South American history that this was probably an effort by the Incas to hide their gold from the cruel and wicked invading Spaniards. They discuss who the gold might belong to now, and decide that it's definitely not Peru's current government, because they're descendants of the Spaniards that the Incas were trying to hide this treasure from in the first place. But it can't go to the native descendants of the Incas either, because the Spanish-blooded wouldn't let them keep it anyways, and besides, quote, how could such treasures be properly divided among a race of wretched savages? Because they'd just drink themselves to death anyways. Okay, so since the Incas were good, civilized people, this gold should go to good, civilized people. Like these random Americans. And, they'll totally do some charity for the Peruvians, and that'll make it all okay. Edna and the captain both agree that since he was the one who found it, the gold should be entirely his, but he pinky swears that if they just let him have all of it, they'll agree with how he chooses to distribute it, and it'll all be fair, but also it's all mine. Okay. Back at the Rackbird camp, which they go exploring and find a bunch of corpses and also a waistcoat and the scraps of a rowboat. The waistcoat belonged to that third sailor from earlier who went off looking for the other two and then disappeared. The boat is the same one that 8 men set off in to find help when they very first arrived. So all 9 of these men were presumably lured in and murdered by the Rackbirds. Now they know that there is no one coming for them. Everyone besides them who got off of the shipwreck is dead except for those 2 other sailors who are missing, presumed dead. So the captain decides that he will leave Edna, Ralph, Mrs. Cliff, Chetatafa, and Mock, while himself and the other 4 African men will go and get help in their last remaining rowboat. Mrs. Cliff and Chetatafa both have some serious concerns about this. Chetatafa is worried about who will be in charge with the captain gone, specifically that if Ralph is left in charge, he does not want to stay. And you know what? That is fair. So he thinks it should be one of the women, specifically Edna, because she would make a better wife, to which the captain says, "Excuse me." And apparently his reasoning is that if they get found by anyone and they don't have anyone in charge, the people who find them are going to steal all their stuff, kill the white people, and he and Monk are going to get re-enslaved. But if they can point at Edna and say that she's Captain Horn's wife and we all belong to him and he left her in charge, no one will mess with them. And the captain's issues with this are not any of the parts of it that don't make any sense. It's that he can't, quote, make a woman his wife just by calling her so. And their response is, "It's fine, don't worry. Chetatafa is some sort of heathen priest guy, and he can do marriages. It's fine." And guys, if a bunch of strangers show up and they try to rob you, it doesn't matter if the marriage is official or not. They're not going to be able to tell. They're not going to ask for the marriage certificate that you're not even going to have. I disagree anyways with the idea that having Captain Horn's wife around will save you from robbery, but even if it would, they're not going to know if it's real or not. Then Mrs. Cliff comes up and interrupts because she has some concerns too that she would like to share, and the captain explains this ridiculous plan that's been concocted, and she says, "Wait, seriously? He could marry you guys? He should definitely do that. That would solve all of our problems." And her concern is that if the captain dies on his way to go get help, who will inherit the treasure? Because he's claimed it all. It's all his. And he says he's written a will, apparently stating that if he dies, all of his possessions should go to and be managed by Edna and Mrs. Cliff, because he doesn't have any close family, and then they'll get what they're due of the treasure. But Mrs. Cliff doesn't believe that this will would be legally binding, and that distant relatives could make a claim on all of his stuff, but that if Edna was his widow, she would have an inherent right, and apparently an agreement to be married before witnesses would be more solid than this will. And this has the exact same issue as with Chetatafa's reasoning, and that's that you guys know that you're allowed to lie, right? The only people who know about the gold are you 4. The only people who know that the captain has claimed it all for himself are you 4. If he dies before getting anywhere, just say that you found the gold after he left and it's all yours. Or say that you agreed to split it 4 ways before he left and then you only get 3/4. I don't know, if you don't want to lie about when you found it. Whatever. You don't have to get married for this to work, is the bottom line. But apparently they disagree. And the captain goes to lay this plan out before Edna, and he stresses that this is just a business proposal to make sure that she gets what she's due if he dies. And she's like, "Okay, but what if you don't die, though?" And he declares that nope, they're not even going to discuss that. They shouldn't think about that. This proposal exists only under the assumption that he is definitely gonna die. He refuses to consider any other alternative, and eventually she says, "Fine, okay." So they have a ceremony, officiated by Chetatafa in front of the big stone face in the rock wall, and they're declared man and wife. They specifically do not kiss, and then off he goes in the rowboat with a small packet of gold tucked away in his pocket. The remaining crew wait around for a month after the captain has left. Mrs. Cliff keeps herself entertained by trying to convert Chetatafa from his heathen ways, but then a sail appears on the horizon. It is a ship. It comes right up to them, and a handful of men come on shore bearing a letter to Mrs. Horn from her husband, the captain. Mrs. Cliff demands that Edna, quote, read us the letter. You can leave out all the loving and confidential parts, but give us his explanation. Ma'am, this is a business marriage. What loving and confidential parts? Captain Horn explains what he has been up to. He gives them instructions on where he wants them to go and what they should do, and says that they should leave all of the gold here untouched. And at the end of it, quote, upon my word, ejaculated Mrs. Cliff. I love that that used to be a speech tag that you could just use. A most remarkable letter. It might have been written to a clerk. No one would suppose it is the first letter of a man to his bride. Excuse me, Edna, for speaking so plainly, but I must say I am shocked. He is very particular to call you his wife and say he is your husband, and in that way he makes the letter a valuable piece of testimony if he never turns up, but... oh, well, no matter. Ma'am, what were you expecting? What about this arrangement screams lusty love letter to you? She has become very invested, I guess, in this being a genuine romantic entanglement. One of the sailors who came ashore to get them gets suspicious while they're all packing up. They're kind of leaving stuff behind. It looks like they might expect someone else to come back, and they're really protective of that hallway that would lead to the lake. They pretend that it's Edna's bedroom and no one's allowed in it because she's getting ready to leave and she's the lady. Before the ship leaves, that man sneaks back on shore. And then we cut to about a month and a half after all of that, with the captain coming back and re-arriving on these shores. He has a scheme together to smuggle the gold out by hiding small bundles of it in bags of guano that he has bought, which he's going to store on the beach of the Rackbird's old camp. The gold and camp in the caves has been disturbed when he gets there, presumably by that guy who hopped off the ship, but he didn't take enough gold to be noticeable, so that's fine. Quote, the task of packing up the guano bags was a disagreeable, almost a distressing one, for the strong ammoniacal odor sometimes almost overpowered the captain, who had a great dislike for such smells. Yet I would hope so. Most people don't love the smell of bat poo, Mr. Captain. You're not special. He can only fit a pretty small portion of the Mound's gold in these shit bags without making them suspiciously heavy, which is kind of a bummer. But after weeks and weeks of hauling bags of gold up and down the shore, he manages to get all of his bags loaded, and he sets off for port. There is also a line in here about how the captain is apparently, quote, the only real friend he, being Maka, had on Earth. And dude, he is traveling right now with 3 other African men that he can actually properly speak the same language with, and who don't treat him as a servant. None of them are his friends. The captain is his only friend, and I say friend in heavy, heavy air quotes. Meanwhile, Edna and co. have spent 4 months in San Francisco in a hotel paid for by the captain, using that little bit of gold that he did take off with him. Chedatafa is serving as Edna's personal attendant, and Mock as Ralph's valet, and they both get some fancy new clothes and seem generally content. Mrs. Cliff gave up and headed out a few weeks ago to go back to Maine, her home, after getting tired of waiting around, deciding that the captain must certainly be dead, because there is no way that it could be taking him this long. We get a very, very weird description of how hot Edna is now that she's not so anxious and stressed about making it on her own. If you remember at the start, she was described as looking older than she really was, but now, quote, under the rays of a sun of fortune, shining indeed but mildly, she had ripened into a physical beauty which was her own by right of birth, but of which a few more years of struggling responsibility would have forever deprived her. I don't know what to say about any of that, so we're moving on. The captain is not dead, and he sends them a letter, and a bank draft for a startling amount of money, having made it with the guano gold to Acapulco. A man has dropped by to see him in Acapulco, one of those 2 sailors who disappeared at the very beginning of their marooning in Peru. His name is Edward Shirley, and he and the other guy, a man named Burke, had wandered pretty far afield looking for civilization to see if they can find help. And they ran into some natives, they found a village and a town, but no one wanted to hike through the desert to help go save their friends. So eventually, after several weeks, they try to go back themselves, but they can't even find the coast, let alone the specific beach that their friends are on. They do find a pair of shoes sticking up out of the sand, attached to some legs, attached to a very dead, dried-out mummy of a man who they don't recognize, so they don't think he was on the ship with them. He's got an envelope with his name on it, A. McLeish, and a wrapped bundle full of gold. This would be that other sailor who snuck off his own ship and then stole some gold and tried to run off. Shirley and Burke decide that maybe they're gonna die if they keep wandering aimlessly through the desert, so they take the gold with them and they go back to civilization. And eventually, they hear through the newspapers that people from the Castor's shipwreck have lived and escaped, which is why they came to find the captain, because they think it'd only be fair that they share some of the gold that they found, like they all shared the misfortune of being wrecked in the first place. The captain decides to tell Shirley about the true wealth of gold that he found in those caves, and Shirley is so shocked that he breaks a chair, and the captain invites him and Burke to come with him to go and get the rest of the gold that he had been forced to leave behind, which he's then going to sail to France to sell. And this is all being stated in the letter to Edna. So back with Edna, knowing that the captain won't be coming to San Francisco for a very long time still, Edna decides that they're going to go and wait for him in France. That way they will see him sooner, and she wants to see Europe, and they can afford it now. So she sends him a letter explaining her plan, and he writes back, and she's upset at his response. He has absolutely no issues with her going to France, but, quote, the tone of his letter was kind. The arrangements he said he had made in regards to the money deposited in San Francisco showed a careful concern for her pleasure and convenience, but nothing in his letter indicated that he believed himself possessed in any way of the slightest control over her actions. Like, my lady, it is the 1800s. You have got a rich husband who is generous with his money, seems to genuinely care about your comfort, and is being totally fine with you making independent decisions and plans. And you are complaining that he isn't being more controlling. Like, she could be upset, I guess, that it's all businesslike and she wishes he were more affectionate or whatever because she randomly decided that she apparently loves him now. I could get over that, even if it seems dumb to expect that to happen randomly out of nowhere, but this wounds my soul. Mrs. Cliff tags along with them to France because she is miserable back at home in Maine, having to keep her new money a secret. The captain doesn't want word getting out about the gold until he actually has it all in his possession, so she has to keep the neighbors from asking questions, but she really wants to renovate her house, and not being able to do it has stressed her out so bad that she looks physically ill. Meanwhile, the captain, Shirley, Burke, and the 4 African men that he's had with him go back to Peru and load up all of the rest of the gold into sacks and then make for France. They make one stop near a port to hand a letter off to another ship to be sent, but they don't actually pull in all of the way, and while they're waiting around, one of these African men disappears. His name is apparently unpronounceable, so they have nicknamed him Ink Spot, which seems racially questionable. So I'm just going to call him Whiskey. He sneaks off the ship to go and have some whiskey, and gets accidentally left behind. He meets 4 men while he's out drinking, one of whom has a bar of gold, identical to the ones that Whiskey has just spent several months hauling around. He gets very, very excited to see something familiar, for some reason, although he thinks it's a bit pathetic that they only have 1 bar of gold, given how many he's seen. He doesn't speak English very well, so he starts doing some drunken charades, and, quote, the 4 men looked at each other and at him in wonder and asked what in the name of his satanic majesty the fellow was driving at. But clearly this guy has seen more of this gold before, and eventually they work out that there is a sailing ship full of gold being transported in secret bound for Paris, so they set off after them to try to catch up, and they bring Whiskey along with them. Back with Captain Horn, he and his crew encounter some rough weather that damages the ship, and she starts taking on water faster than it can be pumped back out, so they beach her on an uninhabited island and take 3 days to unload all of the gold and provisions and have a nice rest by a campfire. This campfire is seen by our 4 gold hunters, who have been following along what the most likely route would be to get to France looking for the captain's ship. The next morning, they send 10 men to shore armed with guns. The captain, Shirley, and Burke see these men coming and hide with their own guns behind a fortress of gold-filled sacks. The black men do not get to have guns. Negotiations between the 2 sides quickly turn to insults, which turns to gunfire, but the captain and crew are completely unharmed and shoot down 9 out of the 10 would-be attackers, and the 10th only lives because he surrenders. They rush after the ship out in the bay in one of their rowboats before the 2 men left on board can sail away. One of these men gets shot, and Whiskey throws the other one overboard after escaping from being tied up down below. So now the captain has a ship, a faster ship even than the one that they were on, and they choose to forgive Whiskey for leading these men to them because he didn't mean any harm by it, and also he accidentally did them a favor when he brought them a ship that isn't sinking. So once more, the gang is bound for France. In France, 8 months have gone by with no word from Captain Horn. He did try to send them one letter when they stopped near but not quite in that port where Whiskey abandoned ship, but that letter ended up in England, accidentally sewn into the jacket lining of a random sailor, never to be seen again. Don't ask. Mrs. Cliff is tired of waiting, again, and thinks he must be dead because there's no way it could take this long, again, but there is nothing they can do but wait. Out in town, Mock and Chedatafa get recognized by a rackbird named Banker, who deserted the gang a while ago, so he wasn't there when the rest of them died in that flood. He learns that Mock and Chedatafa are both in Paris with Edna, and he hears them refer to her as the captain's wife. And seeing two rackbird prisoners with a woman married to the captain, he assumes that Edna is married to the rackbird captain, a man called Ramirez, who Banker doesn't know is already dead. So he goes up to Edna and claims that he has a letter from the captain, which he will only give to her in exchange for $1,000, which, given that this is the 1800s, is a lot, but not more than she has access to. And she's desperate for news, so she agrees, and she meets him in a park with this money, but gets upset when she sees he's holding an envelope addressed to Madame Ramirez. She doesn't have time to say anything about this because Banker gets upset that she's taking too long to hand over the money, which prompts Chedatafa to shout for police, who show up and chase Banker away. Edna makes a hasty exit before she can be questioned by the police, and Banker loses his pursuers so thoroughly that he briefly joins his own search party before disappearing. His purpose in life is now to get revenge at Chedatafa for cheating him out of $1,000. Not long after this, Edna finally gets a real letter from the actual Captain Horn, writing from Marseille. I had to look up how to say that. I thought it was Marseille. I'm sorry, I'm probably still saying it not quite right. Her main reaction is to be upset that his tone is still that of, quote, a good friend, a true and generous friend, but that was all, and I am still left screaming, ma'am, what were you expecting? He can't come meet them, or have them come to meet him, because there's too much business to attend to, and he might have to run off to Berlin and or London to get some things settled with all of this gold, and it all sounds quite reasonable, but Edna finds it very upsetting. The next chapter sees Mock compared to a chimpanzee in the text several times, including in the chapter title, and also the head of Chedatafa, who has, quote, come to look upon his fellow African as a very low creature. And seemingly the only reason for this is that he likes to go out for beers, and Chedatafa is a stuffy old guy who thinks it's undignified. Though, at least a few paragraphs later, the text notes that he's, quote, much less of a fool than Chedatafa took him for. That's not enough. Mock is out one night, having fun, and Chedatafa goes to find him and drag him back to the hotel. And the rackbird Banker stalks Chedatafa until he corners him in an alleyway, and he shouts at him for a while, venting all of his frustrations, and then he pulls out a knife. But all of the shouting drew the attention of Mock, who was already on his way home, and while apparently he only has enough courage to intervene because he had 2 whole beers that night, he wrestles Banker to the ground, gets compared to a chimpanzee for his strength, still yikes, Chedatafa fetches the police, and Banker is actually properly arrested. I'm glad at least that Mock and Chedatafa got to have a moment of vengeance and victory over the rackbirds who so seriously mistreated them, but could we maybe have not called the entire chapter a man-chimpanzee? Banker insists to the police that he wasn't actually trying to kill Chedatafa, just scare him with his knife, and tries to draw focus to the fact that the captain of his old outlaw gang, which he deserted because they're just so vile and he's not, was probably going to come to Paris soon to meet with his wife, so they should definitely keep an eye out because he is a bad, bad man, this captain. Edna's captain husband does arrive in Paris shortly thereafter, and he and Edna see each other for the first time since the day of their business wedding. They only recognize each other by the eyes now that they're not in castaway clothes, and Edna doesn't look stress-old. They have a friendly but awkward catching up. Edna can tell eventually that he wants to turn the conversation in a more productive direction, but she keeps rambling off on tangents about unimportant matters until he eventually just stands up, and they stare at each other for a moment, and he asks, quote, "Are you my wife?" And she answers, "By all that is good and blessed in heaven or earth, I am." So I guess that's settled then. They have an off-screen chat that she later relates to Mrs. Cliff, and apparently, quote, "He has loved me ever since we had been a week on the Castor, and he has always kept it to himself. He had intended to speak to me, but he wanted to wait until I knew him better, and until we were in a position where he wouldn't seem to be taking advantage of me by speaking. And Okay, if this is true, he continues to be surprisingly achieving the bare minimum for an 1800s man. I'm glad it wasn't like he only realizes now that he loves her because she's not so anxious and haggard and old-looking anymore or something, because that's kind of what I expected. But also, we have spent an awful lot of time in this book with the captain, often privy to his thoughts, and he has thought about Edna, like, twice. And never in a particularly strong or opinionated manner where he seemed like he really cared that she existed all that much. Which is probably just so this could be some sort of twist, or to keep up the suspense through the whole letter drama, but it really just makes it sound like he's making this up, which he's not. It's stated afterwards that he was actually thinking about her that way, but still, it wasn't being described that way while it was actually supposedly happening in the past. Anyways, they're gonna go get officially properly married tomorrow just to make absolutely sure that it's all been done right and legally. Chetatafa has apparently for some time been doing some independent research into standard European wedding customs and how things are supposed to be done, and as far as he can tell, the only thing that they didn't do right when he officiated their marriage is that there wasn't a ring involved. So he has gone out and bought one, which he gives to the captain to give to Edna, at which point Chetatafa is satisfied that their marriage is now totally 100% sound. They don't tell him that they're going to go and have someone else redo his job tomorrow. They'll let him know about that later. They do at least decide to use the ring that he bought them in their proper ceremony. The captain goes on a lengthy discussion about the legalities of claiming the gold. He believes he has a solid, nearly indisputable claim at 20% of the total, although in a later chapter he learns he might actually be able to claim as much as 50%. He plans to distribute this 20% among all of the people who were on the caster before it wrecked, including the families of the deceased. Mrs. Cliff is worried because 20% doesn't sound like much. It is, in fact, $40 million, which, if the calculator I found is correct, in today's money, that is over $1 billion. The next afternoon, 2 hours before he is supposed to be married, Captain Horn is brought in by the police, who don't tell him anything and leave him to wait around for a while. The captain tries to get in contact with anyone who could help him out. He doesn't want Edna to know about this and worry that he won't make it to the wedding, but the guy he wants to come down isn't answering, so eventually he calls in Ralph's tutor, Professor Bear? It's a B-A-R-R-E. I was reading it in my head as Barre. I kind of think it's Bar. I apologize, whatever it is. He's been around for a while, but hasn't done very much, so I haven't mentioned him. Apparently he and the captain met the night before. The professor translates between French and English for the captain and the magistrate, and it's explained that Captain Horn has been accused by Banker of being the leader of the Rackbirds. They don't have proof that he is, but he can't prove that he isn't, and no one in France knows him except for his wife and friends, who he could have also deceived. So in desperation, the captain asks for essentially a police lineup. If Banker can't point out who he is from the group, he must not be the real bandit captain. And apparently, quote, this would be a very irregular method of procedure, although it's a little unclear if that's about the idea as a whole or just doing it right now without following some other procedures and bureaucracy first. But I like to think that this is saying no one had ever thought of a police lineup before. So 3 other men are brought in and lined up, and Banker examines them looking for Ramirez. He hesitates, and then, quote, there is no mistaking his nose and eyebrows. I know him as well as if we had been drinking together last night. There he stands. And with his right arm stretched out, he pointed directly to Professor Barr. He is denounced as a liar and dragged off, although he continues to insist that the professor is in fact Ramirez. The captain rushes off, makes it to his wedding, and, quote, as he left the legislation promptly, the captain had time to send to his own hotel for his effects. The direct transition from the police station to the bridal altar had interfered with his anti-hymeneal preparations. Now, I was not personally familiar with the word anti-hymeneal, or hymeneal in general. It is not the same as the word hymenal, which would be of or relating to the hymen. That is where my brain went to. Hymeneal is apparently just of or relating to marriage. So this is anti, like before, marriage stuff. Not, perhaps, so TMI as I may once have worried, although if you look up the definition of hymeneal, it gives you a little example sentence, or snippet in this case. It's only 2 words. The example sentence is just hymeneal orgies. So, Moving on. We are then told that while Banker doesn't know it, there is a reason why Professor Barr's eyebrows were so hauntingly familiar. He is, in fact, the actual cousin of the actual bandit Captain Ramirez. They have the same eyebrows. The professor figures out this relation, and with this cousin being confirmed dead, he apparently stands to inherit an entire Spanish castle. For some reason. Also, Banker gets a decent lawyer and a fairly short prison sentence. Mrs. Cliff is extremely excited to go home, where she can now do all of the home improvement that her heart desires. Shirley and Burke are put in charge of finding the families of everyone from the ship so that they can all be paid. All of the African men are kept on as domestic servants. Quote, they had but little money in their pockets and no reason to expect they would ever have much more, but they knew that as long as they lived, they would have everything that they wanted, that the captain thought was good for them, and to a higher earthly paradise their souls did not aspire. And once again, we say, phew. Chattanooga could at least afford that gold wedding ring, although he had like a year to save, but by that their pay seems not awful, but my dude, my guy, my captain, pay your people. They went through just as much shit as you did, more on account of the rackbirds and all of that. They hauled gold with you across those beaches. They risked their lives. They saved your wife from robbery. They deserve a cut of this thing. Not just a good wage, but a genuine no-strings cut. If they never want to work another day of their lives, they have earned it as much and more than you have. But we couldn't possibly treat them as peers, or people, I guess. Come on now. The final chapter of The Adventures of Captain Horn takes place in a gloomy, rainy moor of Scotland, where a poor old woman living alone in a miserable hut is being evicted for not being able to pay rent. She relies on her son, a sailor, sending her what money he can, but he hasn't sent anything for a while, and she's only been able to eat by other people's generosity. A cart comes up the rain-flooded road, which is supposed to take her to the nearest village from which she can walk to a pauper's house. But on this cart is a stranger with a message for her about her son, Andy McLeish, that he has died, but through him she is going to be receiving £2 a week for the rest of her life. And this is because Shirley and Burke managed to track down the identity of that man whose shoes and then legs and then mummified corpse they had found dead in the sand with a bundle of gold, Andy McLeish, and they decided to also take care of his mother, even though he wasn't actually a man from the Castro itself. Everyone tries to convince his mom to go back inside. They'll help light a fire. It's far too cold out here. Now that you can afford your rent, surely the landlord will let you stay. But she declares that she would rather sleep outside than go back in that god-awful house, and she can afford better now, and meanwhile she's going to go stay at the inn, and if that damn landlord starts asking about overdue rent, he can shove it. I'm paraphrasing, but that is the sentiment, and that is the end. Okay. The Adventures of Captain Horn. Now, there's actually a review of Captain Horn from the 1895 July issue of the Bookman magazine, which I won't read all of, but part of it. Quote, the adventures are of the tamest description. We are all the time approaching the edge of a perilous undertaking, but the moment of suspense is never prolonged, and Mr. Stockton is always in a hurry to assure us that all is well, and human passion rocking the adventurous bark to turbulent upheaval is unknown to him. The pleasing thread of a love story is so thin as to be almost invisible, and we feel cheated out of what could have been made a strong and interesting tale of love. That Mr. Stockton has written a pleasant, readable story, which will keep none awake, but which may afford a few hours' quiet entertainment, undisturbed by moments of excitement, is all that can be said. Yet that is saying a great deal. If we do not take it too seriously, as the present review is in danger of doing, we shall enjoy the story for its own sake. And if you know, that about covers it. I agree, random 1890s book reviewer. It's just not really a super adventurous adventure story. At the start, you think it's going to be a castaway tale, and they set up the rackbirds as this intense threat, and everyone's camping out on the beach, and there's these dangerous men, and the brief period where they're all on watch at night awaiting an attack was reasonably tense, and I was kind of into it, and then the rackbirds just get washed away by an accident, problem solved, and everyone has escaped or been rescued off of that beach by about 34% of the way through the book. So Edna, Ralph, and Mrs. Cliff spend about 66% of this adventure novel in fancy hotels. A lot of this book is just fairly dry descriptions of the logistics of gathering, concealing, transporting, and claiming gold. I honestly kind of had a good time reading it. I mean, I'm easily entertained. I can have fun with a lot of things. My taste is garbage and my standards are low, but it was all right. Apart from, anything even vaguely race-related that was ever mentioned. That was a lot. Okay, that is, I think, about it. So I hope I'll see you in the next one. And in the meantime, this podcast has an Instagram and a Twitter, both at YOBPOD, YOBBPOD. I don't know what all will be there, but I'll at least announce new uploads. And as a piece of life advice from the past, don't sneak off of a ship and maroon yourself in the middle of the desert with no escape plan. Even if you find a spectacular fortune, you are still gonna die of dehydration in the desert.